She thought the greatest threat to her empire was a bad quarter. She was 40 stories above the city, champagne in hand, surrounded by people who called themselves allies, and not one of them would lift a finger when a man with a briefcase and dead eyes decided that no wasn't an answer he'd accept. Rick Davenport hadn't built his fortune by taking rejection gracefully. And tonight, on a rooftop sealed from the inside, Alara Winscott was about to discover exactly how far a desperate man would go, and that the only person standing between her and ruin was a lifeguard nobody had ever bothered to learn the name of. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone ignored, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The invitation had called it a celebration. That was the first lie of the evening. Brighton Cove's Harlow Grand Hotel had 42 floors, and the rooftop sat above all of them, like a crown the building was just barely allowed to wear. On a clear night, you could see the harbor lights stretching south toward the bay, and the city below moved the way cities always do, without caring who was watching. The infinity pool ran along the northern edge, its water lit from underneath in pale blue, and when the wind came off the water, it pushed the surface into small, glittering waves that made the whole edge seem to dissolve into open air. Alara Winscott had been to events like this before. Dozens of them. She knew how they worked, the lighting carefully engineered to make everyone look more attractive than they were, the servers circulating with trays of things nobody really wanted to eat, the conversations that began with compliments and worked their way toward requests. She had learned years ago not to mistake proximity for loyalty. The people who stood closest to you at a party were usually the ones most carefully calculating what you were worth to them. She still came because disappearing from these events meant ceding the narrative to people who would be happy to fill the silence with their own version of who she was. Tonight she wore a deep burgundy dress that stopped just above the knee, practical enough that she could move without thinking about it, formal enough that no one would question whether she belonged. Her dark hair was pinned up on one side and loose on the other, which her assistant had once described as aggressively approachable, and which Alara had taken as a compliment. She was 30 years old and ran a technology company with operations in 6 cities, and she had spent most of those 30 years making sure people never quite knew what she was thinking. She was good at it, most of the time. The rooftop had been rented by a venture collective called Meridian Group, a loose alliance of investors and capital managers who liked to believe they occupied the top tier of Brighton Cove's financial world. They threw events like this 4 times a year, always at venues that required some kind of a rival performance. Tonight's guest list ran to around 120 names, and roughly a third of them were people Alara genuinely needed to speak with regarding Winscott Technologies' planned expansion into the Pacific Northwest. She had already spoken with 2 of them, Marshall Voigt, who ran a mid-size infrastructure fund and had shaken her hand with the careful grip of someone who'd been told to seem warm, and Dana Choi, whose family office was quietly one of the most influential pools of capital in the region, and who had greeted Alara with the kind of genuine attention that was rarer than people realized. Both conversations had gone well. Neither had committed anything. That was fine. You didn't close serious money at parties. You opened doors. Alara accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She rarely drank at these things, which people always seemed to find either impressive or suspicious, and moved toward the northern end of the roof where the infinity pool caught the city lights below. She was standing there watching a small boat push through the harbor far below when she felt someone approach from her left with the particular intentionality of a person who had been watching her from across the room and had decided the moment was right. "Miss Winscott!" She turned. Rick Davenport was 51 years old and carried himself the way certain men did when they had spent decades being told they were the most important person in whatever room they occupied. He was broad-shouldered and wore his silver hair slightly longer than was fashionable, which she suspected was deliberate. A small, curated eccentricity meant to signal that he operated outside ordinary rules. His suit was dark and expensive, and he held his glass of scotch the way men held things when they wanted you to notice they weren't nervous. Alara had met him 4 months ago, when he had approached Winscott Technologies with a proposal to acquire a significant minority stake. The offer had been structured carefully, with enough surface reasonableness that it had taken her finance team 3 weeks to identify the embedded provisions that would have, over 18 months, converted that minority position into effective control. She had declined, twice. The second time in writing, through her legal team, with language that left nothing open to misinterpretation. "Mr. Davenport," she said. She kept her voice pleasant and her expression neutral. "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight." "Meridian has always been good to me," he said, "and I've always believed in keeping connections warm. You understand that, I'm sure." "I do," she said. "If you'll excuse me, I have a revised proposal," he said. "I think you'll find it considerably more—" "I'm not interested in revisiting this," she said. She was not rude about it. She had learned early that rudeness gave people something to react to, and she preferred not to hand anyone a narrative. "I've been clear on our position. Have a good evening." She moved a step around him and he shifted, not aggressively, but enough. Just enough to require her to stop or make the moment a confrontation. She stopped. "4 months is a long time," Rick said. His voice had dropped slightly, not lower in volume, but lower in register. Something underneath it had shifted. "A lot can change in 4 months. My answer hasn't." He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had already made a decision and was simply watching the clock. "Enjoy the party," he said, and moved away. Alara watched him go and felt something cold settle at the base of her spine. She was good at reading rooms and good at reading people, and what she had just read in Rick Davenport's face was not frustration or wounded pride. It was patience, the specific patience of someone who believed they had already won and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. She told herself it was nothing. She moved back toward the center of the roof. Brennan Shaw had been working the rooftop shift for 7 months. His station was the elevated lifeguard chair positioned at the southern end of the pool, a chair that was, in his private assessment, almost entirely ceremonial. The Harlow Grand's rooftop was not exactly a high-traffic swimming environment. On event nights like tonight, the pool was more decorative than functional, and his job mainly consisted of watching that no one drunk enough to be interesting made a bad decision near the edge. He was 37 years old and looked it, not in a worn way, but in the way of someone who had spent a significant portion of their life outdoors doing physical things. He was lean in the way that happened not from a gym, but from years of work that had no particular schedule. His face had lines around the eyes that came from squinting in sun and wind rather than age. He kept his dark hair short because it was practical, and because he had never given it much thought beyond that. The red uniform polo was 2 sizes too large. He had ordered a medium and been given a large and hadn't bothered to follow up, because that was the kind of thing that fell off the bottom of a list when you were also monitoring a 7-year-old's homework schedule and trying to get dinner on the table before 8. He had safety pinned the back so it didn't catch the wind. Nobody had noticed, or if they had, nobody had mentioned it. From his chair, Brennan had a clear view of the entire rooftop. He watched the guests the way he had been trained to watch environments, not focused on any one point, but tracking the whole space in a kind of peripheral survey that noted anomalies and dismissed them or filed them away. It was not something he thought about consciously anymore. It had been built into him over 9 years in naval special warfare, and it had not gone anywhere when he left, regardless of how much he had tried to leave the rest of it behind. He had left because of Maisie. His daughter was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a way of asking questions that made him feel like he was perpetually taking an exam he hadn't studied for. Her mother, Carla, had been gone for 3 years. A car accident on Route 9 in February, in weather that shouldn't have been as bad as it was. Carla had been a pediatric nurse and she had been coming home from a double shift, and the truck had crossed the center line on black ice, and that was all there was to it. No drama, no warning, no chance to rearrange anything. Brennan had been on deployment when it happened. He had been flown home. He had stood in the hospital and then the funeral home and then in the apartment they had shared, and the whole time some part of him had remained profoundly unable to accept that something as large as Carla could simply stop. When his service commitment ended 6 months later, he did not re-enlist. There was no ceremony to that decision. He simply did not sign the papers. He came home to Maisie, who had been staying with Carla's mother, and he moved them into a 2-bedroom apartment in the Brighton Cove neighborhood called Dunmore, which was not fashionable but was 2 blocks from a good elementary school and had a grocery store within walking distance. He had taken the hotel job because the hours were predictable. That was the whole reason. Predictable hours meant he could drop Maisie at school in the morning and be there when she got out in the afternoon. Means test everything by that metric, and the lifeguard job at the Harlow Grand passed and most other things didn't. He did not tell people about his background. There was no strategic reason for the omission. It was more that he had found it complicated. When people learned you'd been a SEAL, they either became slightly frightened of you or they wanted something from you, and Brennan had no interest in either reaction. He was a hotel employee. He watched the pool. He went home and made pasta and helped Maisie with her reading. That was the shape of his life, and it fit him well enough. Tonight the rooftop was noisier than usual. The collective had hired a small jazz trio who set up near the bar, and the combination of music and the 100-plus guests created enough ambient sound that Brennan had given up on catching any individual conversations. He watched movement instead. Body language. The way the crowd clustered and shifted. He noticed Rick Davenport because Rick Davenport was someone you noticed. It wasn't the suit or the silver hair. It was the way he moved through the crowd as if the crowd existed as a medium he was passing through rather than a group of people he was among. There was a particular brand of arrogance in that kind of movement, and Brennan had seen it before in men who had enough money and enough surrounding compliance that they had stopped accounting for other people as real variables. He noticed the two men with Rick because they did not belong. They were dressed appropriately, dark event attire, nothing conspicuous, but they moved incorrectly, too deliberate, too aware. They were not guests enjoying a party. They were working, and the work was not anything that appeared on the event staff roster, because Brennan knew the event staff, and these two were not among them. He watched one of them, a wide man with a flat nose, drift toward the eastern stairwell and stop there, not leaning on the wall but positioning himself in front of it. He watched the second one do the same at the service entrance near the bar. He watched the crowd slowly thin as the hotel's event coordinator, a harried woman named Diane, who was having a genuinely difficult evening, moved through the guests with a rehearsed brightness and said that the main celebration was continuing downstairs in the ballroom. The thinning was gradual enough that it didn't feel like an evacuation, just a natural migration, the way parties always eventually moved. Brennan stayed in his chair and watched. And then he watched Rick Davenport move toward the north end of the pool, toward the woman in the burgundy dress who had been standing there alone, looking out at the harbor. Brennan set his rescue tube across his thighs and did not take his eyes off either of them. Whoa. Alara had not moved from the edge when she heard someone approach again. She knew it was Rick before she turned. Something in the quality of the footstep, unhurried, proprietary, gave him away. She turned. He was holding his scotch glass still. Behind him, the rooftop was nearly empty. She registered that fact slowly, like a word she was reading for the second time and only now actually understanding. The jazz trio was gone. The servers were gone. The 100-plus guests who had been here 40 minutes ago had been moved. The word arrived with a kind of low, careful clarity. There were two men she didn't recognize standing at the stairwell exits. Alara looked at Rick. "The party moved downstairs," Rick said. "More comfortable, better lighting." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't seem in a hurry to go." "I wasn't aware it was moving." "No," he said. "You weren't." She looked past him at the two men, then back at Rick. She kept her expression level because panic was a form of information she was not willing to give him. "Whatever you think this accomplishes." "I have a briefcase," Rick said. "There are documents inside. They're already prepared. All they need is your signature and your company seal, both of which you have with you, because you came here expecting to finalize something with Voight's group." He paused. "I know your schedule, Alara. I've known it for months." The use of her first name was deliberate, a small, clear signal of how he had repositioned this conversation. "I'm not signing anything," she said. "You haven't read the documents yet." "I don't need to." He looked at her with that same patient expression from earlier. "I've spoken to 11 of your major shareholders over the past 6 weeks," he said. 7 of them have agreed to support a board restructuring contingent on certain performance concerns. Your Q3 numbers gave us the language we needed." He paused again, letting that settle. "The announcement was scheduled for 9 tomorrow morning. Tonight was always going to be simpler than tomorrow morning." Alara heard the words and translated them with the part of her brain that had been doing this kind of financial triage for years. 7 shareholders. Board restructuring. The phrasing was lawyered carefully, but the shape underneath it was unmistakable. He had spent 6 weeks building a coalition, and he had come here tonight not to negotiate, but to present a completed fact. "You bribed them," she said. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "I aligned interests. That's the business we're in. That's fraud. Fraud is a word for people who get caught." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded card. "My briefcase is just behind you on the table near the pool equipment. I'd like you to review the first document. If you have questions, I can explain." "I want to leave," Alara said. Her voice was level. "Step aside." Rick looked at her for a long moment. "The exits are temporarily unavailable," he said. She stared at him. "For safety reasons," he added, and almost smiled again. "You can't—" She stopped. Because he could. Because he was standing here on an empty rooftop telling her he already had. And the 2 men at the exits were evidence that he had thought this through in the careful, methodical way of someone who had been planning it long enough to account for most variables. Her phone was in her clutch. She reached for it. "Signal's unreliable up here," Rick said. "Something to do with the city towers and the building's construction. I had it looked into." He set his glass down on the railing. "I'm not trying to frighten you, Alara. I'm trying to arrive at an outcome that benefits everyone." "Taking my company benefits you," she said. "Not everyone." "Your company was built on infrastructure that I helped make possible. That's an argument for another time." He nodded toward the briefcase. "The first document is a transfer of voting rights, temporary. 18 months. Nothing about this is temporary, and you know it." He said nothing. She turned toward the pool because she needed something to look at that wasn't his face, and that was when she noticed the man in the red polo still sitting in the lifeguard chair at the far end. He hadn't left with the others. He was looking at the 2 men near the exits, then at Rick, then, briefly, at her. She didn't know his name. She had been coming to events here for 2 years, and she had never once thought to learn the name of the lifeguard. She had barely registered him as a person, which was something she would think about later with a specific, uncomfortable clarity. But right now she looked at him, and he looked at her. And whatever she saw in his expression in that moment was not the reaction of a man who intended to stay in his chair. Rick followed her gaze. He looked at the lifeguard. He looked back at Alara. "Him?" he said, and he almost laughed. Brennan had already climbed down from the chair. He was walking toward them with the quiet, even pace of someone crossing a room to have a conversation, and there was nothing rushed or theatrical about it, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had come at a run. His hands were at his sides. The rescue tube was still on the chair. He had nothing in his hands at all. Rick watched him approach and felt the kind of contempt that comes from a lifetime of knowing which people are allowed to matter. A hotel lifeguard in an oversized polo. Rubber-soled shoes. No weapon. No backup. Walking toward a situation he had no right to be walking toward. Rick almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Brennan stopped about 8 feet away. He looked at Rick with an expression that was not angry and not afraid. An expression that contained, if you knew how to read it, a very specific kind of professional assessment. "Let her go," Brennan said. His voice was flat and calm and not particularly loud. It didn't need to be. Rick turned to face him fully. "Son," he said, "you have no idea what you're walking into." "I know exactly what I'm walking into," Brennan said. "Let her go and open the exits and nobody gets hurt." Rick looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the man by the eastern stairwell and gave a very small nod. The man by the eastern stairwell was named Colt, though that was almost certainly not what his mother had called him. He was big in the way that came from deliberate construction, wide through the shoulders, thick through the neck, the kind of physical presence that had probably resolved most confrontations before they became confrontations simply by existing in the room. He wore his dark jacket open and moved with the loose, comfortable confidence of someone who had done this kind of work before and had never once lost. He walked toward Brennan without hurrying. That was the first mistake. Brennan watched him come and did not move back. He shifted his weight very slightly to the balls of his feet, which was not something most people would have noticed, and he tracked Colt's hands and shoulders and hips in the automatic, parallel way that took years to build and never fully went away. His breathing stayed even. His heart rate climbed maybe 10 beats above resting and then held there, which was not calm exactly, but was something close to it. the specific physiological state of someone whose nervous system had been trained to function under pressure the way other people's nervous systems functioned sitting at a desk. Colt came in with his right hand first, reaching to grab Brennan by the front of the polo shirt. It was a controlling move, not a striking move, meant to establish dominance of position, to physically relocate Brennan, to make the message physical and clear. It was probably the move that had worked on every civilian who had ever made the mistake of getting in this man's way. Brennan wasn't there when the hand arrived. He had already moved, not backward, which was the instinctive direction, but sideways and slightly forward, inside the reach, and before Colt could adjust his weight, Brennan had his wrist and was rotating it in a direction the joint was not designed to travel. The movement was economical and fast, and contained almost no visible effort. Colt went down onto one knee because his wrist was going to break if he didn't, and the momentum of his own forward charge was doing most of the work. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Colt made a sound, part pain, part surprise, and then Brennan released the wrist and stepped back to the same distance as before, hands at his sides again, breathing unchanged. Alara had not moved. She was watching from the edge of the pool, with her clutch held in both hands in front of her, and her face had the careful, arrested quality of someone who was seeing something they didn't have an existing category for. Rick had gone on very still. The second man, posted near the service entrance, shorter than Colt but quicker in the way he moved, was already pushing away from the wall. His name was Garrett, and he was smarter than Colt, which in this context meant he didn't walk toward Brennan in a straight line. He moved at an angle, circling slightly left, and he kept his center of gravity lower and his hands up in a looser guard. He had some training. Not military, Brennan read. The stance was too high, the footwork too square, but enough that he wasn't going to make Colt's exact mistake. Garrett feinted once to test Brennan's reaction. Brennan gave him nothing. He just tracked the man and waited. Garrett came in low and fast, driving for a tackle, and this time the sequence was different. Brennan had to move backward and to the right, one hand coming down to redirect the driving force of Garrett's shoulder. And for a moment the geometry was messy and close in the way real physical confrontation always was, with no clean lines and no guaranteed outcome, just two people in contact trying to impose their physics on each other. Brennan got his hip behind Garrett's momentum and used it. Garrett went over and hit the pool deck hard enough to knock the wind out of him, and Brennan came down with one knee and held him there until the man's limbs stopped churning, and he understood that struggling was not going to produce a different result. "Stay down," Brennan said. His voice was the same flat register as before. "Don't get back up." He stood. Colt was back on his feet, cradling his right wrist, and for a moment Brennan thought he was going to come again. Something moved in the man's eyes. Calculation, wounded pride, the particular arithmetic of whether it was worth it. Then something else moved behind it, and Colt stepped back. The whole thing had taken less than 90 seconds. Rick Davenport was staring at Brennan with an expression that had lost its architecture entirely. The patience was gone. The careful positioning was gone. What was left underneath was something raw. Not quite fear, not yet, but the early stages of a man beginning to understand that his model of the situation was incorrect. "Who are you?" Rick said. Brennan looked at him. "I'm the lifeguard," he said. "Open the exits." Rick's jaw tightened. He looked at Colt, who was standing near the eastern stairwell with his wrist against his chest and a look on his face that said he was done contributing to the evening. He looked at Garrett, who was sitting on the pool deck with both hands visible and no apparent interest in changing that. "This doesn't change anything," Rick said. His voice had gone tighter. The ease was gone from it, that careful, measured cadence he'd been using since the party cleared out. "You understand what I've put together? The shareholders, the board restructuring, that's already done. That's already in motion. You think restraining 2 people on a rooftop unwinds 6 weeks of work?" "I'm not thinking about your shareholders," Brennan said. "Then what exactly are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about getting her off this roof," Brennan said. He glanced at Alara without moving the rest of his body toward her. "You okay?" She looked at him. There was a pause while she catalogued herself. Her hands, her breathing, the particular tension she'd been holding in her shoulders since Rick's first approach. "Yes," she said. "Your ankle. You're standing a little. I twisted it on the pool deck. I'm fine." "Okay." He looked back at Rick. "Open the exits." Rick straightened. He was 51 years old and had spent most of those years being the person who dictated the terms of things, And the sequence of the last 2 minutes had not made any of that feel less true to him. It had only made him angrier, in the way of men who believe the world owes them a particular kind of deference and become furious when that deference fails to materialize. He was not afraid of Brennan Shaw. He was insulted by him. There was a difference, and it was about to make Rick do something stupid. "You think I don't have contingencies?" Rick said. He reached into his jacket pocket with his left hand, slowly, pointedly, making sure Brennan was watching, and took out his phone. "One call. That's all tonight needs. I've got people downstairs, I've got people at the building entrance, and I've got a lawyer who has been sitting in a car 2 blocks from here for the last 3 hours." "Then make the call," Brennan said. Rick stared at him. "Make it," Brennan said again. "Call your lawyer. Call whoever's downstairs." "That's fine. Make all of it happen." He paused. "Just do it with the exits open. You're not hearing me. I heard everything you said," Brennan said. His voice didn't rise. "You've bribed shareholders. You've got legal leverage. You've got people positioned around the building. Okay. None of that requires keeping her on this roof with the exits locked. That part, this part, tonight, is the part that's going to sink every other piece of it when the police look at the timeline. And they will look at the timeline, Mr. Davenport, because I'm going to give it to them in detail." He let that sit for a moment. "Open the exits. Let her go downstairs. If your case is as solid as you're telling me it is, you won't need any of this." Something moved across Rick's face. Brennan watched it and recognized it. It was the moment when a man who has been operating on a plan encounters a variable the plan didn't account for, and the question becomes whether he can adapt or whether he doubles down. In Brennan's experience, men like Rick almost always doubled down. Not from strategy, from ego, because adapting required admitting that someone else had changed the terms, and men like Rick found that intolerable. Rick moved. He moved fast for his age and size. Brennan gave him that. He closed the distance to Alara in 3 long strides and had his left hand on her arm before Brennan had covered half the ground between them. Alara pulled against the grip, and Rick's fingers tightened, not enough to injure but enough to hold, and he pivoted so that she was between him and Brennan, and he was angled toward the emergency stairwell door on the western wall. "Back up," Rick said. His voice had finally lost the calm. "Back up right now." Brennan stopped. He was 10 feet away. Alara's face was set hard. She was not crying, and she was not making small, frightened sounds, and she was not asking anyone to please be careful. She was looking at Rick's hand on her arm with an expression that was somewhere between cold fury and the concentrated stillness of someone deciding what to do next. "Let go of my arm," she said. "Shut up," Rick said. He looked at Brennan. "I am walking out of here. She is coming with me until I reach my car. This ends quietly. Nobody files anything tonight. Nobody talks to police. This just becomes an incident that didn't happen. That is the best outcome available to everyone, including you." Brennan looked at Rick. He looked at Alara. "Are you going to cooperate with him?" Brennan asked her. She looked at Brennan with that specific look again, the one from before, when she'd been standing at the pool edge and he'd already been moving. "No," she said. "Then don't," he said. Rick's grip tightened. "Don't be." "Alara," Brennan said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not louder, but different, carrying a particular quality of intention. "When I move toward him, pull toward the pool, not away from him, toward the pool. He'll move away from the water." "What are you—" Rick started. "That's your only warning," Brennan said. And he moved. He came at a diagonal, not straight at Rick, which was where Rick was expecting him, and where Alara was positioned as a buffer, but at an angle that required Rick to track him while also managing Alara's weight against his grip. It was a geometry problem, and Rick's instinct was to move toward the stairwell, which meant moving away from the pool edge, which meant pulling Alara with him in the direction away from where she was already beginning to move. She dropped her weight and pulled hard toward the water. Rick's grip broke, not because he released it, but because physics refused to cooperate. Alara went one direction, and Rick went the other, and Brennan arrived at exactly that moment, one hand on Rick's lapel and one arm across his chest, and the momentum of the whole sequence drove Rick back 2 steps, and then into the decorative planting wall beside the stairwell door, which stopped both of them hard. Rick swung with his free arm. It connected with Brennan's shoulder, not where it was aimed because Brennan had adjusted, but it connected with enough force to send a bolt of pain down his arm that he was going to feel for a week. He absorbed it and did not let go. He had Rick against the wall, and Rick was stronger than he looked, working from fury and adrenaline and the panicked strength of a man who understood that the whole constructed architecture of his plan was collapsing. They struggled for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then Brennan got the angle he needed and took Rick down to the deck in a controlled fall. Not thrown, not dropped, because the pool was 8 feet away and the railing was glass and height beyond that was 40 stories. And Brennan had spent his entire career in environments where the difference between controlled and uncontrolled outcomes was the difference between someone going home and someone not. Rick hit the deck. Brennan had his arm, and he held the position until Rick's body registered that it was over and the struggling stopped. Brennan was breathing harder now. His shoulder hurt. His knees hurt from the deck. He looked up. Elara was standing near the pool, and she had her phone out, and she was talking to someone. "Yes," she was saying, her voice rapid and very clear. "Harlow Grand Hotel, Rooftop. I need police and I need building security." She paused, listening. "Yes, I'm safe. There's a man down." "No, not injured. He's being restrained." Another pause. She looked at Brennan. "Is he being restrained?" "He's being restrained," Brennan confirmed. "He's being restrained," she said into the phone. Brennan looked at Rick, who was face down on the pool deck with his cheek against the tile and his arm at an angle that communicated clearly that moving was not a viable option. He looked at Colt and Garrett. Colt had not moved. Garrett was still sitting. Somewhere on the other side of the rooftop, Brennan heard the heavy emergency door bang open. "Signal came back," Elara said. She had ended the call and was looking at her phone. "I guess his information about the signal blockers was more optimistic than accurate." "Or the blocker has a limited range," Brennan said. She looked up at him. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but weighted with the specific quality of a silence that occurs between two people who have just been through something and have not yet agreed on how to categorize it. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she said. It was not quite a question. "Pretty much," he said. "That wasn't... You're a lifeguard." "I work as a lifeguard," he said. There was a distinction in there that he didn't elaborate on. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Rick on the ground, and at the two men across the roof, and at the emergency stairwell door that was still swinging slightly from where someone had hit it on the way through. "Hotel security?" she said. "Probably," Brennan said, "and probably police behind them." She nodded. She looked back at him. Her ankle was bothering her. He could see it in the way she was distributing her weight. But she was standing straight, and her voice had been controlled on the phone, and the expression on her face right now was not relief, and not gratitude, and not shock. It was something more complicated, something that looked like a person turning a moment over in their hands and examining it from several angles before deciding what it meant. "What's your name?" she asked. "Brennan," he said. "Brennan Shaw." She looked at him. "Elara Winscott," she said. "I know," he said. "I've seen you at events here before." "You've seen me." "Hard to miss," he said. And then, because that could be taken away he didn't mean, he added, "You always come alone and you always leave early. I noticed because it seemed intentional." She absorbed that. "It is intentional," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." The door burst open fully then, and 2 hotel security men came through it at a run. Vance, who was the senior officer and had been with the Harlow Grand for 11 years, and a younger man named Ortega, whose radio was already crackling with incoming police dispatch. They took in the scene in the practiced, systematic way of people whose job required them to walk into confusing situations and establish order. Vance looked at Brennan. He looked at Rick on the deck. He looked at Colt. He looked at Garrett. "Shaw," he said, "what happened?" These 3 locked the rooftop exits and attempted to coerce Ms. Winscott into signing documents under duress, Brennan said. These 2 were his hired security. He's the principal. She has details on the financial component. Police are going to want her statement before they want mine. Vance looked at Elara. Elara was already composing herself. Or rather, she was already composed and was deciding what information to lead with, which was a different thing. "I'm Elara Winscott. I own Winscott Technologies. Mr. Davenport has been attempting to force a transfer of controlling interest in my company. Tonight he arranged to isolate me on this rooftop. I have the documentation he brought with him. It's in a briefcase near the pool equipment table. Vance said something into his radio. Rick, from the ground, said, I want my lawyer. You'll have your lawyer, Alara said, and something in her voice had shifted back into a register that Brennan recognized from across the pool 45 minutes ago. Cool, professional, the voice of someone who had spent years making sure other people never quite saw through the surface. You'll have your lawyer in an interview room while my attorney files the injunction that freezes every asset connected to tonight's conspiracy. She paused. That's a word that has a specific legal meaning, Mr. Davenport. I hope yours explained it to you. Rick said nothing. Brennan stepped back from him and let Vance move in. His shoulder was sending consistent updates about its condition, and he was ignoring all of them. He moved to the side of the pool deck, out of the way of what was becoming an increasingly crowded scene, and put his hands on the railing and looked out at the harbor. The boat he'd been watching earlier was gone. The water below was dark except for the reflections of the city, which fractured and reassembled as the wind moved the surface. Brighton Cove at 11 at night looked beautiful from 40 floors up, in the way that things often looked beautiful when you were high enough above them that the details disappeared. He became aware of someone standing beside him. He didn't need to look. Your shoulder, Alara said. It's fine. You're holding it differently than the other one. It'll be fine, he said. A pause. You should have someone look at it. I'll put ice on it tonight, he said. I've had worse. She was quiet for a moment. Below them, on the street, the first police cruiser was pulling up to the hotel entrance. He could see the lights strobing blue and white across the building's face, fragmented by the glass facade. You could have stayed in the chair, she said. He thought about that for a moment. It was a true thing. He could have. He had made a career in the years since leaving the military of staying in the chair, of building a life designed around absence from exactly this kind of moment. Predictable hours, dinner on time, homework at the kitchen table, the careful, deliberate construction of an ordinary life as a deliberate choice, not a failure of ambition. Yeah, he said. I could have. Why didn't you? He looked out at the water. Because nobody else was going to, he said. It wasn't a noble answer. It wasn't even a complicated answer. It was just the thing that had been true when he'd climbed down from the chair, the same way it had been true in a dozen worse situations in places he didn't talk about anymore. Some calculations happened before thought arrived. Alara was quiet beside him. Then she said, Thank you. You're welcome, he said. Below, the police cruiser was followed by a second one. Inside the rooftop, Vance was directing Ortega to take photographs of the exits before they were opened, and the briefcase had been identified and was being treated as potential evidence. And Rick Davenport was sitting against the planting wall with his wrists zip-tied and his silver hair disheveled, and his whole constructed evening coming apart around him in the unhurried, irreversible way of things that have gone wrong enough to be permanent. Ortega came over to Brennan with a notepad. Sir, we're going to need a statement. I know, Brennan said. He straightened up from the railing. His shoulder protested. He breathed through it. Ortega was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who wanted to ask a question but wasn't quite sure how to frame it. Sir, were you the only hotel staff on the roof when this occurred? Yes. And you intervened? Yes. Against two men. And then one more, Brennan said. Ortega looked at his notepad, looked at Colt's wrist, looked at Garrett, who was being helped up by a police officer, and had the deflated, cooperative look of a man who had updated his assessment of how the evening was going. Looked at Rick against the wall. Did you have any... what's your... Ortega stopped. Do you have any background in... Take the statement, Brennan said, not unkindly. I'll tell you what happened. Ortega took the statement. Brennan told him what happened. He told it plainly, without embellishment, in chronological order, accounting for everything he had observed and everything he had done. And he used language that was specific and clean and professional, and at no point during the telling did Ortega's notepad quite keep up with the level of operational detail Brennan was providing. When Brennan finished, Ortega looked at his notes. Then he looked at Brennan. What did you do before this? Ortega asked. Brennan looked at him. I watched the pool, he said. He went back to the railing. The police were downstairs now and up here simultaneously, coordinating on radios. Rick was being helped to his feet in the way of someone being helped up so that they could be helped somewhere else. The briefcase was in a property bag. Colt and Garrett were being walked toward the elevator by two officers who had the resigned, professional body language of people doing a job that had long since stopped surprising them. The rooftop was getting loud in the way that followed violence. The administrative noise of consequence, paperwork assembling itself out of chaos. Brennan stood at the railing with his bad shoulder and his rubber-soled shoes and his oversized polo that flapped in the wind coming off the harbor. And he thought about Maisie, who was asleep right now at Carla's mother's apartment 4 blocks from Dunmore, because it was a Thursday, and on Thursdays, when Brennan worked the late shift, she stayed with her grandmother, and they always made the same thing for dinner, spaghetti with store-brand sauce and garlic bread from the freezer. And Maisie would have eaten most of it and then fallen asleep on the couch watching something she was probably a little young for, and her grandmother would have carried her to bed without waking her, and tomorrow morning Brennan was supposed to be there at 7:15 to pick her up before school. He intended to be there at 7:15. Whatever tonight had been, tomorrow morning he intended to be standing at the door of that apartment at 7:15 with a jacket and Maisie's backpack and whatever they were having for breakfast. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Alara found him again 20 minutes later when the police had taken her initial statement and asked her to come downstairs to continue the process, and she had said she would be there in a moment. She was limping slightly on the ankle. "They need me downstairs," she said. "I know. Go." She looked at him. In the time since the altercation, her dress had acquired a small tear at the hem, from the pool deck probably, or from when Rick's grip had pulled her off balance. Her hair had come down on the pinned side. She looked less like a CEO and more like a person, which he suspected she would find either humanizing or irritating depending on her mood. "You should ice that shoulder tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." "You said that already." "I'm saying it again." She paused. "I'd like to, when this is sorted out, I'd like to speak with you properly. Not a statement, just, I have questions." "What kind of questions?" She looked at him squarely. "The kind that start with, who are you really, and why are you working as a lifeguard?" He almost smiled. Not quite. "That's 2 questions," he said. "I've never been good at staying within budget," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the harbor. He looked back. "Go give your statement," he said. "Get your ankle looked at." "Will you still be here when I'm done?" "I'm going to be here until my shift ends," he said, "and then I'm going home." She nodded, like she was filing that away. "I'll find you," she said. She went back toward the stairwell, moving carefully on the ankle, and Brennan watched her go with the same quiet, peripheral attention he gave to everything on this roof, the water, the city, the people moving through the space. Below, Brighton Cove kept moving. It did not know or care what had happened 40 stories above it. The harbor lights were the same, the streets were the same. The whole indifferent machinery of the city continued without reference to what one man had tried to take, or what one woman had refused to give, or what one lifeguard in an oversized polo had done about it. Brennan turned back to the water. His shoulder hurt. He breathed through it. He stayed at his post until someone officially told him he could go, because that was the job, and he had never once in his life walked away from the job before it was done. He got home at 2:14 in the morning. The apartment on Dunmore was dark, except for the kitchen light he always left on when he worked late, a habit from the first months after Carla, when he'd been irrationally afraid of coming home to complete darkness, as if the dark itself was a form of absence that needed to be refused. He'd never quite broken the habit. At some point it had stopped being about fear and become simply part of how the apartment looked when it was waiting for him, and he'd stopped examining it. He set his keys on the counter and stood in the kitchen for a moment, doing nothing in particular. His shoulder had stiffened in the car and was now communicating its complaints in a more sustained and detailed way than it had been on the roof. He opened the freezer, took out a bag of frozen peas that had been living in there for this exact purpose for 4 months, wrapped it in a dish towel, and pressed it against his shoulder while he sat down at the kitchen table. The table had Maisie's homework on it, long division. She found long division philosophically offensive, had told him so, in those specific terms, at dinner 2 nights ago. "Dad, why does it have to go this long? Why can't it just stop somewhere in the middle?" He had explained that numbers didn't negotiate their length based on what was convenient, and she had looked at him with an expression that communicated how thoroughly unhelpful she found that answer. He sat with the frozen peas and the long division and the quiet of the apartment and let his nervous system begin the slow process of standing down. This was the part nobody talked about. Not in the debrief rooms after operations, not in the transition counseling sessions he'd been required to attend when he left the military, not in any conversation he'd ever had with anyone who hadn't lived it. The thing that happened after, the long, unspectacular come down from a state of total alertness back to being a person who existed in ordinary time. The body didn't make that transition gracefully. It made it slowly and incompletely, like a machine that had been running at high output and didn't have a neutral gear, just a series of speeds that all still required something from you. He sat there for a while. He thought about Rick Davenport's face when Colt went down. The specific recalibration he'd watched happen behind the man's eyes. The way certainty became confusion, became anger in the space of about 4 seconds. Brennan had seen that face before. Not on Rick specifically, but on a particular type of person who had constructed their confidence on the assumption that the world would continue to behave the way it always had, and who had no internal architecture for the moment when it didn't. He thought about Alara at the railing, not the moment after, not the conversation, not the thank you. The earlier moment, when Rick had his hand on her arm and she was pulling against it, and Brennan had said her name and told her to pull toward the pool, and she had done it without hesitation. Not because she trusted him, she didn't know him, had barely registered his existence until 20 minutes before that moment, but because she'd read the situation, and she'd read him, and she'd made a decision in the time it took to breathe. That was not nothing. Most people froze. Most people, in a moment of real physical threat, went rigid and waited for someone else to resolve it. It was a neurological response, not a character flaw. The body's way of conserving resources when the threat exceeded the response library. But Alara Winscott had not frozen. She had assessed, decided, and moved. Brennan found that more interesting than anything else about the evening. He peeled the peas off his shoulder, they'd gone soft and lukewarm, and dropped them in the sink and went to bed. He slept 4 hours. At 6:45 he was up, showered, and out the door by 7, jacket in one hand, and Maisie's backup inhaler in his jacket pocket because the school kept one, but she'd had a rough 2 weeks and he felt better knowing there was a second one in the building. He was at his mother-in-law's door at 7:11. Ruth opened it before he knocked. She always did. She heard the elevator and she was already moving. "Early," she said. 4 minutes. "For you, that's early." She stepped back to let him in. She was 68 and small and had Carla's bone structure, which Maisie had inherited, and on certain mornings when the light was particular, Brennan looked at Ruth and felt the specific quiet ache of resemblance. He never said so. Ruth knew. They had an understanding about the things they didn't say. "She eat this morning?" 2 pieces of toast and half a banana. "She wanted cereal, but I was out of the kind she likes, and she made her feelings known." "She always makes her feelings known." "She really does." Ruth lowered her voice. "She woke up around 4 asking where you were." Brennan looked at her. "I told her you were working late and she'd see you in the morning, and she went back to sleep," Ruth said. "She's fine. I'm just telling you." "Thanks, Ruth." "There's also something on the news." She nodded toward the television in the living room, which was on with the sound low. "A man named Davenport. Something at the Harlow Grand last night." Brennan looked at the television. The lower third graphic read, "Brighton Cove businessman, Rick Davenport arrested. Corporate extortion allegations." The footage was exterior hotel footage, the kind that news cameras always managed to capture even when nobody had been invited. The police cruisers with their lights still going, the lobby entrance crowded with personnel, the kind of organized institutional activity that communicated something significant without communicating what. "You know anything about that?" Ruth asked. Her voice was entirely neutral. "I was on the roof," Brennan said. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was also neutral, in the practiced way of a woman who had spent 3 years watching her son-in-law navigate a life she understood was not the one either of them had planned for. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes." "Your shoulder." He'd forgotten he was holding it differently. He adjusted. "Old thing," he said. "Flared up." Ruth looked at him for one more moment and then turned toward the hallway. "Maisie, your father's here." The sound of small feet on hardwood arrived immediately, which meant Maisie had already been awake and waiting and had simply been conducting the waiting from her room. She appeared in the hallway in her school clothes, jeans and a green sweatshirt that said Brighton Cove Elementary on the chest, With her hair partly brushed and her backpack already on, which meant Ruth had helped with the packing and Maisie had managed the hair on her own with predictable results. "You're here," Maisie said. 4 minutes early, Brennan said. She crossed the hallway and put her arms around him. Not the performative hug of a child doing what is expected, but the unguarded direct contact of someone who needed to confirm that a person was physically present, which Brennan received without comment and without making it a moment, just put his arm around her carefully because of the shoulder and held on. "Ruth said you worked really late," Maisie said into his jacket. "I did." "What happened?" "Something at the hotel. It's handled." She pulled back and looked up at him. She had Carla's eyes, the same dark brown, the same quality of attention in them that made you feel slightly examined. At 7 years old, she deployed this look with an accuracy she didn't fully know she had yet. "You look tired," she said. "I'll sleep tonight," he said. "Come on, we'll be late." They said goodbye to Ruth and took the elevator down and walked the 2 blocks to school in the thin morning light that came in autumn off the harbor, which smelled like salt and cold exhaust, and the particular version of morning that belonged to waterfront cities. Maisie talked about a disagreement with a classmate named Owen that had apparently been ongoing for several days and had reached a new level of complexity yesterday, involving a pencil case and a disputed drawing. Brennan listened and asked the right questions and offered no opinion on Owen, except that 7-year-olds were usually better at resolving things than adults gave them credit for, which Maisie considered and partially accepted. He dropped her at the gate and watched her go in without looking back, because she never looked back at the gate. She was always already talking to someone by the time she passed through it, and then he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the morning, cold with his bad shoulder and his 4 hours of sleep, and let the ordinary, unremarkable texture of the morning settle over the night before. Then he took out his phone and found 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and a text message that read, "This is Alara Winscott. My assistant got your number from the hotel HR office. I hope that's not a problem. I'd like to speak with you when you have time. No urgency. Thank you again for last night." He looked at the message for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked home. He called her back at 10 that morning, after he'd slept 3 more hours with the frozen peas back on his shoulder, and woken to find that the situation had improved from actively unhappy to merely complaining. She picked up on the second ring. "Brennan Shaw," she said, as if confirming something she'd already known. "Ms. Winscott." "Alara, please. After last night, the formality feels a little strange." "Alara, then." There was a brief pause. He could hear background noise on her end, an office environment, people moving, the particular acoustic of a large open space. "I want to apologize," she said, "for calling your HR office. I should have asked you first. I didn't have a better way to reach you, and I didn't think it through." "It's fine," he said. "It's not ideal, is what I mean." Another pause. "How's your shoulder?" "Better." "Are you lying?" He thought about it. "Partially." "I'd like to meet," she said. "Not for a statement. The police have everything they need from me, and your name is in the report, so you'll hear from the detective assigned to the case, but that's separate. I mean, I'd like to meet as 2 people." "Why?" The question came out more direct than he'd intended. He heard her absorb it. "Because I have questions," she said, "which I told you last night. You said you wanted to know who I really was and why I was working as a lifeguard." "I did say that." "Those are personal questions." "They are," she agreed. "You don't have to answer them. I'd still like to have a conversation that doesn't happen on a rooftop during a criminal incident." He almost smiled. "That's a low bar." "I found that low bars are the ones you can actually clear," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Outside the apartment window, the street was doing its mid-morning things. A delivery truck double-parked, a woman with a stroller navigating around it, the school run long finished, and the neighborhood settling into its quieter daytime rhythm. "Coffee," he said. "Somewhere public." "Of course." "And I have to be done by 2:30. I pick up my daughter at 3:15. There was a brief pause. "You have a daughter?" "Yes." "How old?" 7. He heard something shift slightly in the quality of her attention. Not a withdrawal, but a recalibration, like a piece of information had just been slotted into a space she hadn't known was there. 2:30 works, she said. "I know a place on Clement Street, Harbor View. Good coffee, not loud." "I know it," he said. He didn't tell her that he and Maisie went there on Saturday mornings sometimes, because that felt like more information than the conversation required. Noon? Noon, she said. I was there at 11:55, which was the amount early he defaulted to in unfamiliar situations, and he got there to find that she was already seated at a corner table with her back to the wall and a clear sight line to the door, which was not how most people chose to sit in coffee shops, but which made complete sense if you thought about it. She looked different in daylight than she had on the rooftop. The burgundy dress was gone, she was in dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse, and her hair was down, which made her look less like a CEO navigating a cocktail party and more like a person who had had a difficult night and had gotten through the morning. There were shadows under her eyes. Her ankle, he noticed, had a slight wrap visible above her shoe. She stood when she saw him. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't a formal situation, but he thought it was probably a default gesture, the kind of thing you did when you ran meetings all day, and your body had internalized the grammar of them. "You found it," she said. "I live 4 blocks from here," he said. She blinked. "I didn't know that." "Why would you?" They sat. A server came, they ordered, and then there was the particular brief silence that happens when two people who don't know each other have agreed to have a real conversation and are each waiting to see who will start. Alara started. "The police found signal-blocking equipment in a maintenance closet on the 39th floor," she said, "installed sometime in the past week. They also found documentation in Rick's briefcase that goes significantly further than what he told me on the roof." She paused, straightening her coffee cup on its saucer. He had communications with 7 shareholders going back 4 months. Bribery, in the specific legal sense, not just alignment of interests, as he called it. Falsified performance reports submitted to the board, and what appears to be a coordinated timeline that included last night as the final piece. Get my signature under duress, file the transfer documents at 9 the next morning before anyone could contest them. How did your legal team miss the shareholder contact? She looked at him squarely. That's the question I've been asking since 6 this morning. She set the cup down. The short answer is that some of the contact went through intermediaries who weren't obviously connected to Rick. The longer answer is that I had a board member who was in on it, which meant certain information that should have reached me was being filtered. Which board member? Gerald Fitch, she said. He resigned this morning at 7 a.m., which is interesting timing. Is he being investigated? He will be. Brennan absorbed that. So the rooftop was the end of a 4-month operation, he said. Yes. She looked out the window at the harbor, which was doing its ordinary morning things. A container ship moving slowly toward the port, a few pleasure boats, the choppy steel-colored water that came with the season. He came very close, she said. If last night had gone the way he planned it, the filing would have happened this morning, and even with the criminal element later exposed, the legal contest would have taken months, during which time he would have had operational influence over decisions that... She stopped, shook her head slightly. It was well constructed. I'll give him that. Don't give him that, Brennan said. She looked at him. He's a man who spent 4 months deceiving people and then sent 2 hired hands to hold a woman on a rooftop, Brennan said. That's not construction. That's the opposite of construction. Don't give it more credit than it deserves just because it nearly worked. She looked at him for a moment with that examining expression again. Then something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement. Fair point, she said. The coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around her cup in the way of someone who was cold or tired or both, and didn't want to make a point of it. Now, she said. My questions. You said 2. I have more than 2. I started with 2. She looked at him directly. You told Ortega last night that you just watched the pool. He told me that when I asked him about it this morning. You called the detective? I called to provide additional documentation and he mentioned it. She paused. It was not an accurate description of your background. It was an accurate description of my job. That's a very precise distinction. I'm a precise person. She looked at him. Outside, a seagull landed on the window ledge and immediately became indignant about something and left. You were military, she said. It wasn't a question. He'd expected this. Yes, he said. Special operations, she said. Not a question either. He looked at her for a moment. What makes you say that? The way you moved last night, she said. I've seen security professionals. I've seen trained fighters. What you did last night was categorically different. not just physically, the decision-making under it, the way you managed the geometry of where everyone was, the way you kept Rick talking while you were repositioning yourself. She paused. That's not a skill set that comes from a gym. He drank his coffee. It was good. The place roasted their own beans, which Maisie considered irrelevant, but which Brennan appreciated. Navy SEAL, he said. 9 years. She held that for a moment. Why did you leave? He looked at the table. At the wood grain of it, the small ring left by someone's cup from a previous visit that the cleaning hadn't quite removed. My wife died, he said. Maisie needed a parent who came home. The directness of it seemed to stop her. Most people, when he said this, responded with condolence language, the practiced, careful expressions of someone navigating a social protocol they weren't sure of. Elara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, How long ago? 3 years, he said. Car accident. I'm sorry, she said. And it was 2 words, which was the right number. She didn't follow it with anything, which he also noted. So you left, she said, after a suitable pause. I left, he said. Took the hotel job because the hours were set. School drop-off in the morning, school pickup in the afternoon. That was the filter. Everything else was secondary. She nodded slowly. She was doing something he noticed. Not the performance of listening, where people made the appropriate sounds and expressions, but actual listening, where the information was genuinely going somewhere and being turned over. Do you miss it? She asked. Every day, he said, without hesitation. And then, because that answer was incomplete in a way that mattered. And I made the right call. Both things are true. She looked at him. That's an unusual thing for people to accept, she said, both things being true at once. Most things worth accepting are unusual, he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. Then, I owe you more than a thank you. You already said thank you. I mean professionally, materially, what you did last night. I watched the pool, he said. She gave him a look. You disagree, he said, strongly. I was there because it was my job to be there, he said. What happened after was, it happened. I'm not looking for compensation. I'm not offering compensation, she said. I'm offering a different conversation. She set her cup down and straightened slightly, a subtle shift in posture that he recognized as someone moving from social register to professional, not in a cold way, in the way of someone who was more comfortable in professional mode and was accessing it as a form of seriousness rather than distance. Winscott Technologies doesn't have a director of corporate security. We have contracted firms. After last night, and after what the investigation is revealing about how compromised our information environment was, I'm going to need something different, someone internal, someone who understands operational security from the inside. Brennan looked at her. I'm a lifeguard, he said. You're a former Navy SEAL who made a career decision based on your daughter's school schedule, she said. Those aren't the same thing. The school schedule hasn't changed. I'm not asking you to change it, she said. And she said it with a directness that matched his own, without softening it or packaging it as a favor. I'm asking you to consider a conversation. The position would be built around what you actually need: hours, flexibility, structure. Whatever allows you to be where you need to be when you need to be there. She paused. I've built a company by looking for the right people and then figuring out how to make room for them. I'm looking at you and I'm telling you I think you're someone I want in that room. Brennan looked out at the harbor. He thought about the chair at the south end of the pool, the oversized polo, the safety pin in the back, the particular quality of the late shifts, the way the hotel settled around midnight into a kind of institutional quiet that he had found, honestly, restful, a word he would not have expected to apply to that job when he took it, but which had turned out to be accurate. There was something about a job that asked very little of who you actually were that gave the rest of you room to be somewhere else. Room to be at the kitchen table doing long division. Room to be at Ruth's door at 7-Eleven with a jacket and an inhaler. That's a generous offer, he said. It's a practical offer, she said. I need someone I can trust in that role, which is a different thing than generous. You don't know me. I know what I saw last night, she said. And I know that the first thing you said when the security team arrived was that my statement was more important than yours. She looked at him steadily. That's not a small thing. He said nothing. Think about it, said. That's all I'm asking. Think about it and tell me in a week. A week, he said. Or sooner, she said. If you want. He did not say yes, and he did not say no, and he did not say he would think about it, because he was not ready to say any of those things, and she seemed to understand that because she moved on from it without pressing. They talked for another 40 minutes. It was, he noted this with some internal surprise, genuinely good conversation. Not in the performance way of people who were skilled at seeming interested, but in the way that happened when two people with strong opinions were willing to let the other person finish a thought before they started their own. She was funny, in a dry, abbreviated way that assumed you were keeping up. She was direct about her opinions and candid about where they came from. She had built her company from a product she'd developed at 24 in a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 partners, one of whom had been her college roommate and the other of whom was now her CFO. And she talked about those years with a kind of flat, detailed honesty about how hard they had been that was very different from the burnished founder mythology he'd half expected. "Were you ever close to folding?" he asked. "4 times, she said without pause. "Once when our first round fell through. The lead investor pulled out 2 weeks before close, for reasons I still don't entirely understand. Once when we lost a key technical hire to a competitor, and he took about 6 months of proprietary knowledge with him. Once when the initial product didn't perform the way the metrics suggested it should, and we had to rebuild the recommendation engine from scratch in 90 days. She stopped. "That's 3, he said. "The 4th one I'm not counting publicly yet," she said. "But it was last night, so." He looked at her. She looked back, and there was something in her face that was not quite the composed CEO expression from the party, not quite the focused, purposeful person from across the table. Something more open than either of them. Something tired and relieved, and very human in the specific way of a person who had been frightened and was still processing it. "You built something real," he said. "I'm trying to," she said. "No," he said. "Past tense. You built it. Whatever he tried to take, you built it. That's already done." He paused. He couldn't actually take it. He could take the legal structure. He couldn't take the fact that you built it. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're an unusual person, Brennan Shaw," she said. "You said that last night." "I said it differently last night," she said. "Last night it was about how you moved. This is different." He looked at the time, 12:58. He had 90 minutes before he needed to be moving toward the school. Outside, the harbor had gone from steel gray to a brighter slate as the cloud cover shifted, and the light on the water was the kind that made Brighton Cove look like the place in the photographs, rather than the actual place, which was grayer and saltier and better for it. "I have to ask you something," he said. "All right." "What you pulled off last night, keeping your composure that long, keeping your voice level when you called the police, the way you handled Rick before I got involved." He looked at her. "You weren't just frightened. You were doing something, managing it." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean. You were terrified and you were still managing it. Where did that come from?" She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup. "I grew up without much," she said finally. "Not dramatic poverty, just the kind of household where things were always close to the edge and you learned early that panicking didn't change the math. You learned to think." She paused. "My father lost his job when I was 9 and spent about 3 years trying to find another one at the same level and couldn't. My mother worked 2 jobs. I watched her do it without falling apart, which I think, that goes in somewhere. When you see it as a kid, it goes somewhere you can reach later." Brennan listened. "I've also had people underestimate me my entire career," she said. "Rick wasn't the first person who thought a locked door would solve a problem that negotiation couldn't. He was just the first one to take it to a rooftop." She looked at the table. "I'd be lying if I said some part of me wasn't cataloging everything he said for the legal case, even while I was scared." "I noticed," he said. She looked up. "You went through the briefcase information in your head while you were talking to him," he said. "I could see it. The way you went quiet for a few seconds after he mentioned the shareholders. You were counting." She stared at him. "7, she said slowly. "He said 7 shareholders. I was counting which ones." "And I got to 4 before you started moving," she said. She shook her head slightly, the way of someone surprised to have been seen clearly by someone they hadn't been paying attention to. "You noticed that." "I noticed things," he said. "What else did you notice?" He considered what to say. "That you were angrier than you were scared," he said. By the time I reached you, the fear had been replaced almost entirely by anger. Not panic anger, the other kind. What's the other kind? The kind that makes you useful, he said. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression that he didn't try to name. You should come work for me, she said. You already asked. I'm asking again. You said you'd give me a week. I'm giving you a week, she said, and I'm also asking again. The corner of her mouth did the thing it had done before. Not quite a smile. Both things can be true at once. You said so yourself. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the window, a second seagull landed on the ledge, assessed the situation, and made a different decision than the first one had. Brennan finished his coffee. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. But he could tell from the way she said it that she knew it wasn't all she was hoping for. And she could probably tell that he knew too, and they both let that sit there without making it into something it didn't need to be yet. He left at 2:28, which gave him enough margin to walk to the school at a normal pace without hurrying, and he was at the gate at 3:12, 3 minutes early. And when Maisie came through the doors, she was in the middle of a conversation with a girl from her class, and she almost walked past him before she saw him. Dad? 3 minutes early, he said. She grabbed his hand and kept talking to her friend for another 30 seconds, and then said goodbye and turned, and they started the walk home, her hand in his, her backpack bouncing with the slightly chaotic energy of someone who had been sitting still all day and was now remembering how to move. Good day? He asked. Owen apologized about the pencil case, she said. Good. I didn't accept it yet, she said. I'm thinking about it. He looked down at her. Don't think too long, he said. 7-year-olds don't have that kind of time. She considered this seriously, which was how she considered most things. Maybe tomorrow, she said. Reasonable, he said. They walked home in the afternoon light, and the shoulder hurt, and his 4 hours of sleep were making themselves known in the particular way of fatigue that arrives. Not all at once, but in quiet waves. And the street was ordinary and unhurried and smelled like autumn and exhaust, and the harbor 2 blocks away, and Maisie's hand was small in his, and she was talking about something else now. A book they were reading in class, something about a dog. And Brennan walked and listened and let the morning and the night before and the coffee and Alara Winscott's direct, careful eyes and the question she had asked him settle somewhere he would look at later. Not now. Now there was homework and dinner and a 7-year-old who had an opinion about a pencil case. He would think about the rest of it later. He didn't call her the next day. He thought about it, held the phone a few times, put it down. Not because he'd decided against the job, and not because he hadn't thought about what she'd said. He'd thought about it more than was probably useful, in the fragmented way you thought about things that hadn't fully resolved yet, turning them over while making breakfast, and while walking Maisie to school, and while standing in the shower at 6:40 in the morning, staring at the tile grout. The thinking didn't produce a clean answer. It produced a series of questions that weren't really about the job, and he knew that, and he let the week pass the way she'd asked him to. The investigation, meanwhile, did not wait for anyone's thinking to catch up. On the 3rd day after the Rooftop, the Brighton Cove Financial Crimes Unit issued a press statement confirming that Rick Davenport had been formally charged on 4 counts, 2 related to corporate fraud, 1 related to criminal coercion, and 1 for conspiracy to commit extortion. Colt and Garrett, whose legal names turned out to be Marcus Holden and Gary Prentice respectively, had been charged as accomplices, and had both retained lawyers who were already in preliminary conversations about cooperation agreements, which in Brennan's experience meant that whatever Rick had told them about the solidity of the plan had not survived contact with a serious criminal charge. Gerald Fitch, the board member who had resigned at 7 a.m. the morning after, was named in a supplemental complaint filed by Alara's legal team. The complaint alleged that Fitch had acted as an internal conduit for Rick's shareholder communications, metrics and documents submitted for board review. Fitch's lawyer calls the allegations a politically motivated overreach by a company trying to deflect attention from its own governance failures, which was the kind of statement that sounded confident in a press release and would mean precisely nothing in a courtroom. Brennan read all of this in the way he read most things, straightforwardly, without commentary, filing the pieces in the order they arrived. What interested him more than the legal architecture was a detail buried in the Financial Crimes Unit's secondary disclosure, which his old teammate from the Navy, a man named Devin Walsh, who now worked in private financial intelligence and called occasionally to catch up, and occasionally to pass along things he found interesting, had flagged in a text. The bribery payments to the shareholders hadn't come from Rick's primary business entity. They'd come from a subsidiary holding company registered in a different state, which held assets that were not reflected on any of Rick's publicly available financial disclosures. The subsidiary had been active for 6 years, meaning Rick had been building this kind of infrastructure, the quiet machinery of undisclosed leverage, for a very long time before he'd ever turned it toward Elara Winscott. Brennan texted Devin back. "How deep does the subsidiary go?" Devin's response came 2 hours later. "Deep enough that the feds are interested. State charges may not be the end of this." Brennan read that and thought about what Elara had said at the coffee shop, that Rick had come very close, and that the construction had been careful. "I thought about 4 months of methodical work, the shareholder outreach, the board member, the signal blockers installed in a maintenance closet, the lawyer in a car 2 blocks from the hotel." He thought about the specific kind of patience required to build something that intricate, and what it said about the person who had built it. And then he thought about the fact that a man who had been building that kind of machinery for 6 years had decided that Elara Winscott's company was worth the effort, which said something about the company. He called her on the 5th day. She picked up on the first ring, which he suspected had less to do with him specifically and more to do with how she managed her phone in general. "Brennan," she said. "I have a question before I answer yours," he said. A brief pause. "Go ahead." "The subsidiary holding company the Financial Crimes Unit identified," he said. "The one the bribery payments came from. How much did you know about it before the arrest?" Silence for a moment. Then, "Nothing. We knew about Davenport Capital as a primary entity. The subsidiary wasn't on our radar." "It's been active 6 years," he said. "I know that now." Which means he had undisclosed infrastructure running parallel to his public profile for 6 years, and nobody in your orbit, not your legal team, not your board, not your investor relations people, picked it up. She was quiet. "That's not a criticism," he said. "That's the security gap. That's what the contracted firms were missing, because they were looking at the surfaces. Public filings, known entities, visible relationships. The threat came from the layer underneath." "Yes," she said. Her voice was careful. "That's exactly right. That's what you need someone internal for," he said. "Not a reaction function, a monitoring function. Someone who looks at the layer underneath as a matter of course." "Yes," she said again. "That's a different job than what you described at the coffee shop," he said. "You said Director of Corporate Security, but what you're actually describing is closer to an intelligence function. Threat assessment, relationship mapping, identifying anomalies in the information environment before they become operational problems." Yes, that's more accurate. "I want the title to reflect the actual function," he said, "and I want authority to build the process the way I think it should be built, not fitted into an existing structure that wasn't designed for it." Another pause. When she spoke, there was something in her voice that might have been the early stages of relief, though she controlled it. "Those are reasonable conditions. And I leave at 2:15, he said. "Every day. Non-negotiable, permanent, regardless of what's happening. If there's a crisis at 2:15, the crisis gets managed remotely or it waits until the following morning." "Agreed," she said without hesitation. "You agreed fast." "You told me why on day 1, she said. "I don't need it explained twice." He looked out the apartment window. The delivery truck that had been double parked 3 days ago was back in the same spot, apparently having established a relationship with that particular stretch of curb. "I have one more condition," he said. "Tell me." "I want to meet your senior leadership team before I agree to anything formal," he said. "Not an interview, just a meeting. I want to see how information moves in the room." She was quiet for a moment. He could almost hear her thinking, not reluctance, but assessment, fitting pieces together. "I can arrange that this week," she said. "Thursday morning, if that works." "It works." "Brennan." Her voice changed slightly. Still professional, but with something underneath it that was more direct, less structured. "I should tell you, the leadership team already knows what happened on the roof. Most of Brighton Cove knows at this point. The press has been—" "I know," he said. "They're going to look at you differently because of it." "I know that too," he said. "That's partly why I want to see how information moves in the room. People who've just been told a story about someone behave in ways that tell you a lot about how they process things." She was quiet. "You're already doing it," she said. "Doing what?" "The monitoring function," she said. "You've been doing it for years. You were doing it from a lifeguard chair." He said nothing. "Thursday, 9 a.m., she said. "I'll have the front desk expecting you." "Send me the address," he said. "You don't know where the offices are?" "I know where they are," he said. "I'd like it in writing anyway." She almost laughed. He could hear it not quite arrive. "I'll send it." He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then he wrote on a piece of paper at the bottom of Maisie's long division homework, "Thursday, 9 a.m., Winscott Technologies," and put it on the refrigerator under the magnet shaped like a lighthouse that Maisie had bought at the Harbor gift shop the previous summer and insisted was art. He looked at it for a moment, then he made dinner. The offices of Winscott Technologies occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Hargrove Street, 6 blocks from the harbor, in the part of Brighton Cove that had been light industrial 20 years ago and was now the kind of mixed-use district where a coffee roaster and a biotech startup shared a building, and nobody found this strange. The lobby had exposed brick and warm lighting and the specific aesthetic of a company that had grown fast enough that the office design still remembered trying to look like the kind of place talented people wanted to work. Brennan arrived at 8:52. He wore charcoal slacks and a white dress shirt with the collar open. No tie, because he didn't own one that wasn't from his uniform days, and those didn't feel right. And he had his shoulder in a better state than Thursday of the previous week, the bruising mostly resolved and the movement mostly returned. The front desk woman whose name tag said Petra looked at him with an expression he recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had been told a story about a person and was now calibrating it against the actual person standing in front of them and finding the calibration imperfect in some direction. It was either more or less than she'd expected. He couldn't tell which. "Mr. Shaw," she said, "Ms. Winscott is expecting you. 32nd floor. I'll let her know you're on your way up." "Thank you," he said. The elevator had glass walls on one side and looked out over the building's internal atrium, which went up 6 stories and had the slightly aggressive greenery of a space that had been designed by someone who read studies about plant exposure and cognitive performance. Brennan rode up and watched the atrium pass and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd developed and maintained with some deliberateness. The ability to arrive at a situation without having already decided what it was. The 32nd floor opened into an open-plan space that was quieter than he'd expected for 9 in the morning, with the focused atmosphere of people who had been at their desks for a while already. Several heads came up when he came off the elevator, and several went deliberately back down. He let that happen without adjusting his pace. Alara met him at the elevator. She was in navy and gray today, professional and unadorned, and she looked like she'd slept better than she had at the coffee shop 3 days ago, which meant she'd probably slept adequately rather than well, but adequately was an improvement. She extended her hand. "On time," she said. 8:58, he said. "I said 9. "I know what you said," he said. She almost smiled and led him toward the conference room. There were 6 people seated around the table when Brennan walked in, and he assessed all of them in the first 4 seconds in the way that he assessed rooms. Not consciously cataloging, just receiving. A man in his mid-40s, with the compact energy of someone who ran on less sleep than was recommended and had made peace with it. That would be Marcus Trent, CFO, who Alara had mentioned. A woman about Alara's age with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, who was watching Brennan with open, direct curiosity. That would be Petra Lynn, the CTO and co-founder, the college roommate. A general counsel, a VP of operations, a head of investor relations, and a board member. Brennan didn't have a name for yet, who had the measured, evaluating expression of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms where things were decided and had learned to withhold reaction as a professional tool. Alara introduced him around the table. He shook hands and said names back to confirm them, which was a habit that had started as a training technique and was now simply how he met people. "I want to be direct about why we're here," Alara said once everyone had settled. "I'm considering bringing Brennan on as Director of Intelligence and Security, a new internal role. This meeting is not a vote. I make personnel decisions. But I work best when the people in this room have had a chance to form their own perspective on someone before they're working alongside them, and I think Brennan would agree that it benefits him to see how we operate before he commits to anything." She looked at Brennan. "That's accurate," he said. Marcus Trent leaned forward. He had the directness of someone who had done financial modeling for 20 years and had lost patience for preamble. What exactly would the role involve? Because we've had security contractors for 5 years and what you're describing sounds more like... It's not the same function, Brennan said. Your contractors watch what's visible. I'd be building the process for watching what isn't. Trent looked at him. What specifically? Relationship mapping between your key stakeholders and external parties. Anomaly detection in board communications. Financial intelligence on entities pursuing strategic relationships with the company. Not just surface disclosures, but the secondary and tertiary connections that public filings don't capture. He paused. What happened 4 months ago started as a pattern. Patterns have early signatures. If you have someone looking for the right signatures, you don't end up on a rooftop at 11 at night hoping someone stays in their chair. Trent absorbed this. How do you build that function without it becoming something that generates paranoia internally? By being transparent about its scope, Brennan said. The function looks outward. It maps external threat actors and external influence attempts. It doesn't monitor employees. It doesn't operate inside the organization. The moment that line gets crossed, the function loses its value because everyone stops communicating naturally. He looked at Trent. That's a fair concern, and I'd have it myself if I were in your seat. Trent nodded once. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it was acknowledgement, which from someone with Trent's energy was probably equivalent. Petra Lynn spoke next. She had a directness that came from a different place than Trent's. Less transactional, more genuinely curious. I read your service record, she said. The public portion. Brennan looked at her. Okay. 9 years, 3 overseas deployments. You left as a senior chief. She studied him. The hotel was a big step down. Yes, he said. You made that choice deliberately. I did. Why does that matter to me, or to us, here? He thought about this for a moment. It was a good question, framed well. Not asking for the personal story, but for the professional relevance. Because the choice I made 3 years ago, and the way I made it tells you something about how I weight things, he said. I don't optimize for position or for compensation. I optimize for function. What does the job actually require, and can I actually do it? When the hotel job fit what was required at the time, I took it without needing it to be more than it was. He paused. If this job fits what's required, I'll do it the same way, without needing it to be a different shape than it is. Petra Lynn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Alara in the way of two people who knew each other well enough to communicate without words. Alara looked at the table. The board member who hadn't spoken yet, Brennan had placed the name by now, Raymond Chu, who had joined the board 18 months ago and whose background was in institutional investment, cleared his throat. I have to address something directly, Chu said. The incident at the Harlow Grand has received significant press coverage. Some of that coverage has been favorable to you. More favorable, perhaps, than the company would ideally want in relation to a new executive hire. There's a perception risk, that the hire looks reactive, like we're bringing in the man who saved our CEO as a gesture. Silence around the table. Brennan looked at Chu. Chu held the look without flinching, which Brennan respected. That's a legitimate concern, Brennan said. What's your question? Chu looked slightly surprised at the directness. Whether you're aware of it and how you'd handle it. I'm aware of it, Brennan said. I'd handle it by doing the job well enough that the origin story becomes irrelevant, which takes about 6 months if the work is real. He paused. The perception risk is higher if the hire is performative. If the role is real and the function is real and the outcomes are real, the origin story becomes a footnote. Chu considered this. And if it takes longer than 6 months, he asked? Then we have a different conversation at 6 months, Brennan said. I'm not interested in a role that doesn't produce something measurable. If it doesn't, I'll tell you. Chu looked at Alara. He'll tell us, he said, as if verifying. He told the detective at the Harlow Grand that he watched the pool, Alara said, while having just neutralized 3 people. I think we can assume he'll tell us. Something moved around the table. Not quite laughter, but the release of tension that approximated it. The meeting went another 40 minutes. They talked about the existing security contractor relationship and how a transition would work, about the preliminary findings from the financial crimes investigation and what they revealed about the gaps in Winscott's threat awareness, about what resources Brennan would need to build the function from scratch. He answered questions plainly and asked several of his own about how information moved between the leadership team and the board, about the investor relations communication protocols, about what the company's policy was on background checks for new board members. That last question landed with a particular weight. "We don't have a formal policy," the general counsel said. "There are standard disclosures, but a formal independent background assessment isn't—" "It should be," Brennan said. Not harshly, just as a statement of fact. Gerald Fitch was on this board for 3 years. If there had been a systematic review of his external financial relationships at the time of his appointment, the subsidiary connected to Davenport Capital might have been visible. It was 6 years old by the time Fitch joined. The general counsel looked at the table. "That's going in the governance review," Alara said. "There's going to be a governance review?" Petrolin asked. "There is now," Alara said. Brennan left the building at 10:47. The meeting had run over, which he'd expected. These things always ran over when the real conversation finally started displacing the formal one. He walked back toward Dunmore along Hargrove Street, and the morning was cold and bright, and the harbor was visible at the end of every east-west block like a blue gap between the buildings. He thought about the room he'd just left, the way information had moved around the table, who deferred to whom, who spoke over whom, who listened when they weren't the ones talking. Trent was sharp and somewhat guarded, the kind of person who processed externally and then protected his conclusions. Petrolin was open and direct and had the easy confidence of someone who had been right often enough not to need to perform certainty. She was measured and institutional. The general counsel was careful in the way that lawyers were careful, which was useful in the right context and limiting in others. And Alara at the head of the table, quieter than he'd expected, given how she'd been one-on-one. She'd let people finish. She'd let the silences breathe. When she did speak, it was to redirect or to commit, not to fill space. He noted that she'd told Chu that she made personnel decisions without apology or caveat, and that she'd done it in a tone that was firm without being defensive, and that nobody at the table had pushed back on it. She ran the room the way she'd managed the rooftop, with a great deal happening underneath a controlled surface. His phone buzzed. It was Alara. "Well?" He put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking. He would answer properly, not in shorthand. The question deserved more than a text in the middle of a sidewalk. He waited until he was home, until he had coffee in front of him, and the apartment's particular midday quiet around him. The absence of small feet, the refrigerator with its lighthouse magnet, and its piece of paper that said Thursday 9 a.m. And then he called her. "I have one more question," he said when she picked up. "Of course you do," she said. "Gerald Fitch, 3 years on the board. Where did the referral come from?" A pause. "Marshall Voigt." Brennan sat with that. Marshall Voigt, who ran the mid-size infrastructure fund, who had shaken Alara's hand at the party with a carefully warm grip, who was, according to the Meridian Group's event roster, a founding member of the collective that had arranged the rooftop party. "Has anyone spoken to Voigt in the context of the investigation?" Brennan asked. "Not yet," Alara said. Her voice had gone careful. "He's not named in any of the current filings." "He referred Fitch to the board," Brennan said. "Fitch was Rick's conduit. Rick used Meridian Group's event to set up last Thursday night." He paused. "That's 3 connections to Voigt. Any one of them is coincidence. All 3 of them is a question." Silence on the line. "I'll call the detective," she said. "Do it today," he said. "And do it yourself, not through your legal team. The legal team will frame it as a disclosure, which positions it as something you're managing. You calling directly positions it as something you noticed and reported, which is different. That's... Yes. You're right." A pause. "Brennan." "Yes." "You've been doing the job since Thursday night," she said. "You know that." He looked at the refrigerator, the lighthouse magnet, the piece of paper. "Send me the employment terms," he said. "I'll look at them tonight." He heard her exhale, one short, controlled breath that she probably didn't intend him to hear. "Tonight," she said. "After dinner," he said. "I have a 7-year-old. "After dinner," she said. "Of course." The terms arrived at 6:43, while he and Maisie were finishing the pasta that had become their Thursday default. Store sauce, because neither of them could tell the difference, and Brennan had accepted this about himself years ago, with grated cheese from the green shaker that Maisie insisted on applying herself in quantities he found excessive. He read through them after she was in bed, at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him, and they were fair, more than fair. The title was correct, the authority was real. The salary made the lifeguard hourly look like what it had always been, which was a temporary structure built for a specific purpose that had now served that purpose. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the last page. He recognized her handwriting from the documents on the rooftop. She wrote in small, clear print, the letters contained and deliberate. The note said, 215 is in the contract, Section 7, Clause 4, non-negotiable and permanent per your conditions, EW. He turned to Section 7. There it was. In legal language, precise and binding, the position holder shall maintain the right to conclude working responsibilities by 1415 daily, regardless of operational circumstance, except in declared emergency situations mutually agreed upon in advance. He read it twice. Then he put the contract down and sat with his cold coffee in the kitchen, with the lighthouse magnet on the refrigerator, and the long division on the table, and the quiet of the apartment at 9:15 at night, when Maisie was asleep and the street outside was doing its late evening settling. He thought about the 9 years he'd spent as a different person in different rooms. He thought about the hotel chair and the oversized polo and the frozen peas in the freezer and the specific strange piece of a life deliberately made smaller. He thought about Maisie asking where he'd been at 4 in the morning and Ruth opening the door before he knocked and the dog book and Owen and the pencil case. He thought about a rooftop and a woman in a burgundy dress who had not frozen, and a briefcase, and signal blockers in a maintenance closet, and a subsidiary 6 years deep that nobody had been looking for. He thought about Marshall Voigt, who had a warm grip and 3 coincidental connections to a criminal conspiracy and who had not yet been interviewed by anyone. He thought about the monitoring function that didn't exist yet, and the governance review that hadn't started, and the board appointment protocol that had never been written. He thought about a lot of things. Then he picked up his pen and signed the contract on page 9, where the signature line was, and he put it in the return envelope she'd included and set it on top of his keys so he'd remember to mail it in the morning. He washed his coffee mug. He checked that the kitchen light was on. It was. It always was. And he went down the hallway and pushed Maisie's door open 2 inches, the way he did every night, and she was a small shape under the covers with 1 foot hanging off the side of the mattress in the chaotic geometry of childhood sleep. He pulled the door back to its usual gap and went to bed. His shoulder was almost entirely fine now. He barely noticed it. He slept well. In the morning, he mailed the contract on the way to school, dropping it in the blue box on the corner of Dunmore and 5th, while Maisie walked slightly ahead of him, still mid-sentence about the dog book, and the envelope fell into the box with the flat, conclusive sound of a decision that had been made. Maisie didn't notice. She was at the part of the book where the dog had done something unexpected, and she needed Brennan to understand the full context before she could explain why it mattered. He caught up to her and listened. The morning was cold, and the harbor was 2 blocks east, and the school was 2 blocks north, and the day was ordinary in exactly the way he had spent 3 years carefully building ordinary days. He would be there at 2:15. He always would be. But for the first time in 3 years, something was waiting for him on the other side of it. Something that required more of who he actually was. Something he hadn't admitted until a rooftop and a sealed exit and a woman who had not frozen that he'd missed. He let Maisie finish the story about the dog. Then he walked her to the gate and watched her go through it without looking back, same as always, and turned and started toward Hargrove Street. He had a job to do. Marshall Voigt was interviewed by the Financial Crimes Unit on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the rooftop. Brennan wasn't in the room. He had no standing to be in the room. He was a corporate intelligence director, not law enforcement, and the line between those two things was one he intended to keep clear. But he had given the detective assigned to the case, a methodical woman named Clara Reeves, who had the patient, unshowy demeanor of someone who had closed difficult cases by outlasting them rather than breaking them open, a detailed written summary of the 3 connection points between Voigt and the conspiracy. He had documented the Fitch referral, the Meridian Group overlap, and the party guest list, cross-referenced against Voigt's known business relationships with Davenport Capital going back 4 years, a relationship that appeared nowhere in Voigt's board referral disclosure because the disclosure form Winscott Technologies used didn't ask the right questions. That was the first governance change Brennan had recommended in his second week on the job. The board referral disclosure form now asked 11 additional questions. The general counsel had looked at the new form with the expression of someone who was simultaneously grateful and embarrassed, which Brennan took as confirmation that it was the right change. Detective Reeves called him after the Voight interview. "He lawyered up before we got through the first 20 minutes, she said, which is interesting because the questions we led with were relatively soft. What did you lead with? The Fitch referral, when it happened, what the basis was, whether he had any ongoing relationship with Fitch outside the board context. And he stopped talking. His lawyer stopped him talking, Reeves said, which is not the same thing, but has similar implications." A pause. "What I can tell you is that the financial forensics team has been looking at the subsidiary holding company for 3 weeks now, and there are transaction records that connect it to a shell entity that also appears in Voight's infrastructure fund's secondary disclosures. It's indirect. It's going to take time to fully trace." "But it's there," Brennan said. "It's there," Reeves confirmed. "I'm telling you this because you found the thread, and because Alara Winscott is the complaining party, and because you'll hear about it through official channels, eventually, anyway. I'd rather you hear it from me and not do anything with it that complicates the investigation." "I'm not going to do anything with it," Brennan said. "That's your work, not mine." "Good," Reeves said. "I just needed to hear you say it." He told Alara that same afternoon in her office, which had a wall of windows that looked east toward the harbor. She listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand was how she absorbed significant information. Not passively, but with a kind of concentrated stillness that meant she was running parallel tracks simultaneously and didn't want noise on either of them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Voight referred Fitch to the board," she said. Not a question, just turning it over. "Yes. I've known Marshall Voight for 6 years," she said. "He was at my company's 3rd anniversary dinner. I have a photograph of us somewhere." Brennan said nothing. "I'm not surprised," she said then. And the flatness in her voice when she said it was not the flatness of someone performing composure. It was the sound of a person who had learned, through specific and repeated experience, that proximity was not the same as loyalty, and that learning it again still cost something. "You couldn't have known," he said. "No," she said, "but I should have had a structure that could have known." She looked at him. "That's what you're building." "That's what I'm building," he said. She nodded once and turned back to the harbor window, and he left her office and went back to his own, which was smaller and had no harbor view and contained, currently, 3 whiteboards covered in relationship maps and a desk with 2 monitors and a coffee mug that said Harlow Grand Hotel on the side that he'd brought from his old locker because it held a reasonable amount of coffee and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. Petra Lynn had noticed the mug on his 3rd day. She'd stood in the doorway of his office with her reading glasses pushed up and looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "Is that intentional?" she'd asked. "It holds coffee," he said. She'd nodded like that was a satisfying answer and left. He'd kept the mug. The weeks after that settled into a rhythm that was different from the hotel rhythm, but had its own particular texture. I was at his desk by 8:15 after drop-off, and he left at 2:15 without exception, and in the hours between, he did work that used more of his brain than anything had in 3 years, mapping the company's external relationship network, identifying the information asymmetries that had made the conspiracy possible, building the monitoring protocols that would make the same approach significantly harder to execute in the future. He met with Reeves twice more to provide additional documentation. He sat through a board session in which the new governance framework was presented and adopted, and he answered questions from Chu and the other board members with the same plainness he'd used in the initial meeting, and by the end of it Chu had shaken his hand in a way that was genuinely warm rather than institutionally warm, which was a different thing. He made mistakes. He misjudged the internal politics around the security contractor transition and had to have a conversation with the VP of operations that was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. He submitted a risk assessment report in week 3 that Alara had sent back with 4 specific questions in the margins, all of which were fair and 2 of which he should have anticipated. He had a meeting with the investor relations team that went sideways when he pushed too hard on their external communications protocols, and the head of IR, a woman named Sandra Patel, who had been with the company since year 2 and had opinions, told him flatly that he was welcome to advise on security implications, but the relationship strategy was her domain. She was right. He'd acknowledged it and adjusted. She'd seemed mildly surprised that he'd acknowledged it without making it into a negotiation. They had a better working relationship after that. What he did not do, in any of those weeks, was make things personal. He worked alongside Alara every day, and their conversations were direct and often long and covered a range that went beyond strictly professional. He told her things about the Navy that he hadn't told anyone in Brighton Cove, not because she extracted them, but because questions came up organically, and he was no longer carrying the particular habit of concealment that had made the hotel job feel safe. She told him things about the company's early years that didn't appear in any profile or interview, the version of the story before it became a story, when it was just two people and a product, and the sustained anxiety of not knowing whether any of it would amount to anything. They were colleagues. They were becoming something closer to friends, in the careful, incremental way that adults with complicated lives became friends. Not through shared leisure, because neither of them had much of that, but through shared work and the trust that accumulated when someone proved, over and over, that they would tell you the truth even when a softer version was available. He did not push past that. He knew the shape of what was there. He wasn't blind to it, and he was fairly sure she wasn't either. But there were things that needed to settle first. The investigation, the governance restructuring, the simple passage of enough time that any shift between them wouldn't carry the weight of the rooftop or the contract or the particular circumstances of how they'd met. He didn't want those circumstances to be the reason. He wanted the circumstances to be so far behind them by the time it happened that they were simply background, a story they'd tell someday, with the kind of shorthand that meant you'd been over it enough times that it no longer needed all its original detail. So he waited. Not with the patience of someone suppressing something, with the patience of someone who had learned the difference between the right moment and the moment you wanted it to be, and who had enough respect for both of them not to confuse the two. Maisie, who had no such patience, had opinions of her own. She met Alara for the first time on a Saturday in November, which happened accidentally in the way that things that aren't quite accidental happen. Brennan had brought Maisie to the office because his usual Saturday sitter had canceled and he had to pick up a document he'd left on his desk, and he had promised Maisie it would take 8 minutes and she was welcome to time him. Alara was in her office. She was often in her office on Saturdays, which he had noted and said nothing about, because he was not her schedule manager and it was not his place to comment on how she used her own time, even if he had thoughts about it. She came out into the hallway while he was at his desk and stopped when she saw Maisie. Maisie was sitting in Brennan's chair, spinning slowly, timing him on her watch with the focused authority of a bailiff. 6 minutes 40 seconds, Maisie said to Brennan. Then she saw Alara. Hi. Hi, Alara said. I'm timing him, Maisie explained. He said 8 minutes. He's going to make it, Alara said. He's very precise. Maisie looked at her with the full attention look. Do you work here? I do, Alara said. I'm Alara. I'm Maisie. My dad works here now too. She paused. He used to watch a pool. I know, Alara said. I was there. Maisie's eyes widened slightly. Were you the one he helped? Alara looked at Brennan. Brennan was getting his document and attempting to project the energy of someone who was not listening. Yes, Alara said. That was me. Maisie seemed to consider the full significance of this for a moment. Then she looked back at her watch. 7 minutes, 12 seconds, she announced. Brennan had the document. Done, he said. You made it, Maisie confirmed. She climbed out of the chair with the slight ceremony of someone vacating an important position, and then she looked at Alara again. Dad never talks about it, she said. The thing that happened. He just said something happened at the hotel. It was complicated, Alara said. He handled it. He handles things, Maisie said, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a known property of the physical world. That's just what he does. She looked at Brennan. Can we get the Saturday coffee now? We can get the Saturday coffee now, he said. He looked at Alara. She was looking at Maisie with an expression he couldn't fully read from the angle he was at. Something open in it, something that was paying very careful attention. Do you want... He started, then stopped, because he wasn't sure yet how he wanted to finish the sentence, and he didn't want to finish it wrong. Alara looked at him. The place on Clement Street, she said. That's where we go, Maisie confirmed. She was already putting on her jacket. They have hot chocolate. It has too much milk in it, but I drink it anyway. Alara got her coat. It was not a date, and it was not a family outing, and it was not the start of anything that had been decided. It was three people walking 6 blocks to a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, which was an ordinary thing that sometimes contained something else inside it, the way ordinary things sometimes did when you stopped trying to control what they were and let them be what they actually were. Maisie held the door open for both of them, because she had been told that holding doors was polite, and had taken this seriously in the sweeping, total way she took things she had decided to take seriously. She then sat across from Alara and asked her 11 questions over the course of 45 minutes, covering topics that included how tall the building was, whether Alara had a dog, what the worst thing about having a lot of money was, and whether she thought Owen's apology had been genuine or performed, for which she provided full context. Alara answered all 11 questions without talking down and without performing interest she didn't have. She told Maisie she didn't have a dog, but had thought about it. She said the worst thing about having a lot of money was that it was harder to know who was being honest with you, because some people told you what they thought you wanted to hear. She said that from what Maisie had described, Owen's apology sounded genuine but incomplete, that sometimes people were sorry without fully understanding what they were sorry for, and that was a different thing than not being sorry at all. Maisie thought about this very seriously. "So I should accept it, but tell him which part he missed," she said. "That's one approach," Alara said. "That's a good approach," Maisie said, as if this had been confirmed. Brennan drank his coffee and watched his daughter interrogate a CEO and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the specific, unguarded warmth of a moment that was not trying to be anything other than what it was. Rick Davenport pled guilty in January. The plea came after 6 weeks of his legal team attempting to negotiate terms that preserved some portion of his assets and his reputation, both of which the prosecution was not inclined to preserve. In the end, he accepted a negotiated agreement, 4 years on the corporate fraud count, with additional civil liability for the shareholders he had bribed, restitution payments to be determined in a separate proceeding, and a permanent bar from serving as a director or officer of any publicly held company. Gerald Fitch, in a separate proceeding, accepted a deferred prosecution agreement that included full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, a substantial financial penalty, and a voluntary lifetime ban from board service. Marshall Voigt's situation was more complicated and slower. The financial forensics connecting him to the subsidiary took 5 additional months to fully document, and his legal team was more aggressive and better resourced than Fitch's. He was ultimately charged on 2 counts, one related to the Fitch referral, which the prosecution argued constituted knowing participation in the board infiltration scheme, and one related to financial transactions between his fund and the Davenport subsidiary that the forensics team had traced through 3 intermediate entities. His case was pending as of the following spring, with no trial date set, which was how these things went when the money was large enough to sustain a long defense. Brennan followed all of it. He followed it the way he followed all the threads in the external environment, carefully, without attachment to a particular outcome, focused on what the information revealed about the patterns underneath, rather than the specific resolution of any one case. The resolution was Reeves's job. The pattern was his. What the pattern revealed over the months of the investigation was something he had suspected from the beginning, but which the documentation made concrete. Rick Davenport had not been an isolated actor. He had been the visible layer of a network of relationships that used the surfaces of legitimate business, board positions, fund investments, industry event organizations, as infrastructure for the kind of influence that didn't appear in any filing or disclosure. The network wasn't a conspiracy in the formal sense. It was looser than that. It was the kind of thing that existed in the ambient space between what was legal and what was honest, maintained by people who had learned to keep those 2 categories separate. Brennan wrote a 70-page assessment of the network for Alara in February. She read the whole thing, which he knew because she sent back 14 specific questions. He answered them, and then they spent 2 hours in her office going through the implications. And by the end of the conversation, they had a framework for a threat assessment protocol that would become, over the following year, the most sophisticated internal corporate intelligence function in the Brighton Cove business community. Not because it was aggressive or invasive, but because it was thorough and honest and built on the principle that the best defense against hidden influence was rigorous visibility into the surfaces where hidden influence operated. Winscott Technologies' next board appointment went through an 11-question disclosure review, an independent background assessment, and a conflict of interest mapping process that cross-referenced the candidate against Brennan's external relationship database. It took 3 weeks longer than previous appointments had taken. Alara presented the new process to the board without apology. "This is what governance looks like when it's actually functioning," she said. "It's slower, it's more work, it's worth it." Nobody argued with her. The governance review generated a piece in a financial industry publication about corporate security practices in the post-Davenport landscape, in which Alara was quoted and in which Brennan was referred to only as the company's intelligence director, a former military specialist whose background the company declined to detail. He had specifically asked them to decline to detail it. He did not want his name in publications. He wanted the function to work. Those were different things. Petrolin had printed the article and left it on his desk with a note that said, "You're a footnote, congratulations." He had put the note on his refrigerator next to the lighthouse magnet. Spring came the way spring came to coastal cities. Gradually, without announcement, the cold pulling back in increments and the harbor changing color as the light changed quality, going from the steel gray of winter to something with more blue in it, and then more green, and the city along the waterfront doing the slow exhale it did every year when it remembered that warmth was possible. Maisie turned 8 in March. She had decided with the absolute conviction of a person who had given a matter serious consideration that she wanted her birthday dinner at the coffee shop on Clement Street, which she described as our place, in a way that made Brennan carefully not look at Alara, who was sitting across the table and also carefully not looking at him. Alara had been to 3 dinners by then. The first had been in February, nominally to discuss the board assessment process, which they had finished discussing in 40 minutes, and then talked about other things for an hour and a half. The second had been on a Friday when Brennan had picked up Maisie from a school event and run into Alara, who had been in the neighborhood for reasons that may or may not have been entirely coincidental, and they had all ended up at the Thai place on Harbor Road. The third had been a deliberate dinner, planned 2 days in advance, without a work pretext. Just a dinner, which both of them had acknowledged without making it into something that required a category before it had one. At Maisie's birthday dinner, Alara brought a gift wrapped in dark green paper with a card that said, "Happy Birthday, Maisie," in the same small, clear print Brennan recognized from the contract note. Maisie opened it and found a book. Not a children's book, or not exactly. It was a book about a woman who had built a small shipping company in the 1890s in a coastal city that looked a lot like Brighton Cove, illustrated with maps and old photographs and written in prose that was serious without being dry. Maisie looked at it for a long moment. "Is she real?" she asked. "She was," Alara said. "Did she have a lot of problems?" "Constantly," Alara said. "Did she fix them?" "Most of them," Alara said. "The rest she learns to live around." Maisie looked at the book and then at Alara with the full attention look. "That's a good answer," she said. "She gives good answers," Brennan said. Alara looked at him. Something moved through her expression, unhurried, unguarded. The specific quality of a look between two people who have moved past the point of pretending they aren't paying attention to each other. He let it land. He didn't look away. Maisie was already reading the first page of the book, propped open against her water glass, apparently unconcerned with whatever was happening on the other side of the table, which was either because she hadn't noticed or because she had noticed and had decided it was fine, and with Maisie it was impossible to say which. It was fine either way. The Rooftop reopened for the summer season in late May. The Harlow Grand had done a renovation, new lighting along the pool edge, new seating, a different bar layout. The infinity pool was the same, the view was the same, the harbor 40 stories below was the same. The hotel had offered Brennan a standing invitation to any events in the space, which he took as a gesture of goodwill and which he intended to use exactly once. He chose a Sunday evening in June when the light came in low and gold off the water and the harbor was doing its late-day things. The container ships moving out, the pleasure boats moving in, the city below settling toward evening in the gradual, unhurried way of a place that had been here long enough not to rush. He brought Maisie. He brought Alara. They arrived at 6:15. The roof was not hosting an event. He'd checked, and then he'd called ahead, and the hotel manager had been delighted to arrange a quiet evening on the space because the story of what had happened here had become something the hotel referenced, carefully, in its own way, and because Vance from security had told the manager that Brennan Shaw was someone you did small favors for when you had the chance. Maisie went straight to the railing and looked down at the city with the fearless, cataloging energy of a child encountering height as information rather than danger. "It's really high," she said. 40 stories, Brennan said. "Can you see our street?" "Not quite. The harbor district is—" He stood beside her and pointed. "That way. You can see the edge of Dunmore from the northeast corner." They went to the northeast corner. Maisie looked with serious attention. "I can see the school," she announced. "You cannot see the school." "I think I can," she said, with the serene confidence of someone who had decided a thing. He let her have it. Alara was standing at the north edge, near the pool, at the spot where she had been standing 10 months ago, with a glass of sparkling water and a company she was trying to hold together, and no idea that the evening was going to go the direction it went. She was looking out at the harbor. She was wearing something simple and pale blue, and her hair was down, and she looked not like the CEO from the party, and not like the woman from the coffee shop 3 days after, and not like the colleague from the office. She looked like herself, which was something he had come to understand took her considerable effort to access in places where other people's expectations were loud, and which she arrived at more easily now than she had 10 months ago. He walked over and stood beside her. They stood there without talking for a moment. The water in the pool caught the evening light and fractured it. The harbor below was gold and gray. "I used to watch you from that chair," he said, "before any of this." She looked at him. "You always stood at the north edge," he said. "Always the harbor side, never the city side." "The harbor is real," she said. "The city sometimes feels like a performance." He thought about that. "That's true of most cities. It's more true when you're trying to run something in it," she said. "There's always a version of yourself that the city expects. The harbor doesn't expect anything. It's just water." She paused. "I used to come up here sometimes when the office got too loud, before Rick turned it into something else." "Does it feel like something else now?" She looked at the water. "No," she said. "Not tonight." He was quiet for a moment. I thought about this," he said. "Coming back here. For a while I wasn't sure whether it would feel wrong." "Does it?" "No," he said. "It feels like a roof." She almost smiled. "A very good roof." "Best one in the building," he said. She looked at him with the look she had. The real one. Not the composed professional version. Open. Direct. The one that did not pretend to be looking at something else. "Brennan," she said. "I know," he said. She waited. "I've known for a while," he said. "I was waiting for it to be the right time." "Is it the right time?" He looked at Maisie, who was now at the northeast corner trying to identify specific landmarks in the Dunmore neighborhood and providing a running commentary to no one in particular. She was fine. She was always fine. He looked back at Alara. "I think you're the most honest person I've met in a long time," he said, "and I've met you in a lot of different circumstances, so I have a reasonable sample size." She looked at him. "I think you work too much," he said, "and I think you do it because you don't entirely trust that things will hold together without you, which is something I understand better than most people." She was very still. "And I think you're funny," he said, "in the way that people who are very serious are sometimes funny, the kind that sneaks up on you." "That's 3 things," she said. "I have more," he said, "but those are the first 3. She looked at him. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, the careful composure around the edges and something completely unguarded underneath it. And in this light, this late in the day, with the harbor below and the pool beside them, and Maisie narrating her geographic discoveries from the northeast corner, the composure was only barely winning. "I work too much," she agreed. "I know. I'm not going to stop entirely. I'm not asking you to. But I could—" She stopped. Started again. "There are things I've been not doing because it seemed like the wrong time, or because the company needed more of me, or because—" She looked at the water. "I've been alone for a long time, not unhappily, but alone, and I'm not sure I entirely know how to do the other thing anymore." "Neither do I," he said. She looked at him. "I was alone for 3 years," he said. "I built the whole life around alone. I got very good at it." He paused. "Then a man with a briefcase showed up on a roof, and I climbed down from a chair, and now my refrigerator has a lighthouse magnet and a footnote and a birthday dinner from the coffee shop on Clement Street, and apparently I don't know how to do alone anymore either." Something moved through her face. "The footnote is on your refrigerator," she said. "Next to the lighthouse magnet," he said. "Maisie has opinions about both of them." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. The real version, not the professional version. Brief and unguarded and genuine. From the northeast corner, Maisie announced, "I can 100% see the school." "You cannot," Brennan said. "I can," she said, and walked over to them to explain exactly why, gesturing at a section of the city below with the precise authority of someone presenting evidence. She stopped when she reached them and looked at the two of them standing together, close enough that the space between them was no longer the professional distance of colleagues, close enough that Maisie, who was 7 3/4 and considerably more observant than people generally accounted for, took note of it with the quiet, efficient assessment of a child who had been waiting for information to confirm something she had already suspected. She looked at Alara. She looked at her father. She took Alara's hand, not dramatically, not with any speech or ceremony. She just reached up and took it the way she sometimes took Brennan's hand when they were walking somewhere, with the natural, matter-of-fact directness of a person who had decided that something was fine and was acting accordingly. Alara looked down at Maisie's hand in hers. Then she looked at Brennan. He looked back. There are things you build deliberately, with plans and timelines and specific conditions, and there are things that build themselves out of the decisions you make when you're not trying to build anything, when you're just trying to get your daughter to school on time, or stay in your chair, or keep the kitchen light on so the apartment doesn't feel too empty when you come home late. Brennan had spent 3 years building a life that was deliberately small. He had made it small as an act of love, because small meant predictable, and predictable meant present, and present was the only thing Maisie had needed from him when the rest of everything had become too large and too permanent to fix. He did not regret a single day of it. The smallness had given him back his daughter, and in doing so had given him back himself, in a quieter and less decorated form than the man he'd been, but a form that fit better. And then the smallness had reached its natural end, the way seasons end, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual shift in the quality of the light, a change in the temperature of the morning, a different smell coming off the water. The shape that had been necessary became the shape that was no longer sufficient. He had mailed a contract into a blue box on a November corner and walked his daughter to school, and it had not felt like a surrender, and it had not felt like a recovery. It had felt like a door. You don't always get to choose your doors. Sometimes the door chooses you. Shows up on a rooftop in the form of 2 men at the exits and a woman in a burgundy dress who is not going to sign anything. Sometimes the choice you make in that moment is the same as every other choice you've ever made. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's consistent with who you are, whether or not you've been advertising it. Rick Davenport had looked at the man in the oversized polo and seen the least important person on that roof. He had been looking at exactly the wrong thing. The lesson was old, and it kept needing to be relearned, and no amount of money or sophistication or carefully constructed leverage had ever changed it. The thing that saves you is almost never the thing you can see from a distance. It's the thing that's already there, steady and unremarked, doing its job in the space between the emergencies. The thing nobody thought to look at because it didn't look the way important things were supposed to look. Brennan stood on the roof of the Harlow Grand Hotel on a June evening with Alara Winscott beside him and his daughter holding her hand. And the harbor below was gold and the city was doing its ordinary evening things. And he thought about the chair at the south end of the pool, and the frozen peas in the freezer, and the safety pin in the back of the polo, and the 3 years of carefully constructed ordinariness that had turned out to be not a retreat from his life, but the part where his life was actually happening. He thought about Carla. Not with the weight he used to carry that thought, which had been immense for a long time, and had become, over years, something more like a scar than a wound, present, real, but no longer the thing you noticed first. Carla would have found all of this interesting, in the straightforward, specific way she found most things interesting. She would have had opinions about Alara, and she would have expressed them directly, and she would have been right about most of them. She would have approved of the lighthouse magnet. She would have thought the footnote was funny. She would have told him, if she could have, that he'd done all right with the kid, and that he was allowed to be done apologizing to the universe for surviving her. He thought she would have been right about that, too. Maisie was explaining something to Alara about the harbor, the container ships, their origins, a thing she had learned at school about shipping routes that she had clearly retained in remarkable detail. Alara was listening the way she listened to things that actually interested her, which was completely, with the full attention quality that Maisie had apparently recognized as genuine from approximately the first Saturday in November. The light off the water was doing the thing it did in June at this hour, going from gold to something between orange and rose, the harbor surface going dark at the edges, while the center stayed lit, the city below waking into its evening self, while the sky above still held the day. Brennan looked at it. He looked at the two of them. He thought, this is the thing you can't plan for. This is the thing that happens in the space between the plans. He thought, the chair was good. The chair got me here. And here, standing on a roof he had once watched from a lower position, in a life that had made room for more of who he actually was, beside a woman who had not frozen and a daughter who held her hand without ceremony, here was better. Not perfect. Not finished. Not without the ordinary difficulties that would accumulate as any life accumulated them, the friction of two people learning each other's limitations, the work of building something between three people across the uneven terrain of what they'd each already been through. But real. That was the word. Real in the specific, unpolished way of things that had been earned rather than arranged. Maisie reached over with her free hand and took Brennan's, and the three of them stood at the edge of the roof as the evening came down over Brighton Cove, and the harbor went from rose to gray to the first deep blue of night, and the city lights came on below them one by one, and none of them said anything for a while because some things don't need words. They need only what was already there.